But lowering calories isn't the only way to lower your insulin. Now, it is one way to lower your insulin in a controlled, precise, and measured manner, right? Because this is essentially what calorie counting can attribute a lot of its success to, is the fact that people begin to count everything they eat, and essentially they know exactly how much they're eating, no more, no less, and in one sense, exactly how much they're lowering their insulin, no more, no less. So that does help people stay on top of things, because it's hard to eyeball a diet, unless there's a diet that simply is restrictive of a certain macro, like the keto approaches. But when we're talking about managing insulin in a way that's inclusive of all foods, simply, you need precision. You need calorie counting. That's the way it works, because it's your only way of managing exactly how much insulin you're lowering. But of course, macronutrient ratios of that calorie makeup does play a role, in addition to the person's subjective insulin sensitivity and how much insulin they produce, right? Hey there. My name is Anthony Romano, and I'm going to tell you in this video the most important fat loss rule that you need to know about, regardless of whatever diet you're doing. So essentially, this is what I call the insulin theory of fat loss. So this is not to be confused with the carbohydrate insulin model from Dr. Jason Fung, but this is a huge concept that will teach you how fat loss works, and you can bend this towards whatever diet you're doing to maximize fat loss. So if you've seen my other videos, you know that I very much enjoy the ketogenic diet. Been doing it for almost 8 years now, and intermittent fasting and prolonged fasting. These will tie into what I'm about to talk about, but they're not essential. So keep that in mind. Don't think that I'm trying to, force you into my cult of fasting and ketogenic dieting. This is simply teaching you about the mechanisms from those techniques and how they apply to any fat loss diet. So what I wanted to call this video, but didn't because it doesn't have as catchy of a title name, was insulin is the currency of fat loss. Now, the common misconception, well, not necessarily misconception, but the common notion is that calories are the currency of fat loss. Now, calories are the primary driver of fat loss, but the actual mechanism that causes fat to be stored comes from insulin, okay? And the lack of insulin will signal other hormones to mobilize fatty acids as a fuel source, okay? So I'm trying to gloss over this in certain ways, but essentially, insulin itself is the primary currency we're talking about, even when we're talking about, just reduce your calories, right? Everybody knows calories because it's the easiest thing to turn to, because it is the primary driver of fat loss, but it's not the only thing. And realistically, the method by which calorie reduction works is primarily using insulin. So before I get into the explanation of this, I'm going to tell you that I want you to think about, fasting or ketogenic diets, or if you've, played around with any of those, or you know anybody who plays around with those. But oftentimes you'll hear people be very adamant, or maybe you're one of those people yourself who is very adamant about those techniques because you just feel, or this person just feels like it works better in a certain way. And of course there's the position that, fasting, for example, intermittently or prolongedly, will lower your calories, and it's a tool to cram in a smaller calorie amount in a more satiating way. So before I even make shots at the whole fact that it's clearly more filling, more satiating, because of the hormones involved in that, right, in that span of not eating, I'm going to explain that one way to get into a low insulin state is by fasting, and so not eating, or not eating carbohydrates, the most insulinogenic food. So the whole main premise that everything here relies on, which is true, a factual premise, is a low insulin state will yield more fat loss, right? A low insulin state implies there is more of this demand, okay? It's more demand for fuel to be burnt, right? Because that's essentially when you're eating food, right? It doesn't matter, anytime you eat anything, your insulin's gonna go up. Depending on what you ate will determine how dramatically it goes up. But the surefire way that we know to get into a low insulin state is by eating less or eating no carbohydrates. So essentially, when you are either reducing your calories, right, daily, not eating any calories, or not eating any carbohydrates, you're going to lower your insulin and get in this low insulin state. Now, the only premise you have to buy into is that a low insulin state yields more fat loss. And it does. There's very clear science on this. The fat burning will never occur in the presence of high elevated insulin. It just does not happen. Insulin is an anabolic hormone. It wants to build things. The second there's an insulin surge, your body is looking for where this should go. Okay? And this is why working out is inherently an insulin sensitivity increaser, because it increases the demand for, tissue to be repaired, right? So insulin, like I said, it's an anabolic hormone, just like money. Money is an anabolic currency. And although insulin isn't doing all the parts of this picture, right? Like when insulin's low, the thing that's actually going to be doing the work is partially glucagon. Glucagon is going to mobilize the glucose out of your liver. Well, it's going to turn it into glucose from glycogen first and then distribute it. And then also it's going to mobilize fatty acids from the liver. So essentially, insulin is just in part the signaler of these things, and I'm talking about it to make it more streamlined. Okay, I'm leaving out the extra bells and whistles here because insulin's the main one you need to watch out for. This is simply a more precise way to look at the picture, right? The previous picture was just calories, right? Very general. We're getting a little bit more specific than calories, right? Before getting to the specifics of each individual hormone, like leptin, which will regulate a lot of these things, I'm breaking this down to the most precise way possible, which is the only one that really you have to manage on a moment-to-moment basis, is insulin. So, back to managing this insulin. When you're in a low insulin state, you will be experiencing higher rates of fat oxidation. And when your insulin is elevated, you will not be experiencing this. You will be experiencing storage. Insulin regulates, essentially, whether your body is storing or burning. Okay? It's the hormone that is the metabolic regulator in a certain way. Even though leptin is the master controller of these things, insulin is the one that, when it's elevated, you can immediately influence the metabolism to start storing, okay? And when it's lowered, you can immediately influence the metabolism to start burning stored fuel. Now, you may have heard me talk before about this whole qualitative and quantitative analysis of fat loss. And I'm pretty proud of that example, and I'm going to keep expressing that theory. But here's my viewpoint on the qualitative quantitative. Calories is simply the quantitative side of things. It is the numerical number that you attach for the daily total of amount of energy burned, right? Or that you will burn, right? We'll say your BMR, your basal metabolic rate, adds up to 3,000 calories a day. So essentially, after activity and everything, you are going to stay the exact same if you just eat 3,000 calories a day, based on your average activity level and your height and weight and age and all that stuff. So that is previously what was known as the quantitative method, right? That is what everybody thinks of because it's simply the easiest one to figure out. It's consequential. It's you just go, oh, this many calories, boom, easy. But it doesn't allow you to get more precise about how you feel in the moment, how your appetite is being regulated, and your workout performance in certain ways. So the qualitative side of things is hormones. As I was explaining, the hormones that actually do the work for these fat loss mechanisms. Of course, we can lower calories and experience a hormonal chain reaction, but to cut off your sophistication at calories is basically you're picking one variable and you're not allowing yourself to get better fat loss. Maybe if you're a coach, to get better fat loss for your clients, those types of things. Because when you micromanage these little variables, you'll experience a much smoother process, whether it's by maximizing performance, whether it's by making your appetite reduced so you're not biting at your ankles all night when you're hungry going to bed. We've all had that experience. And that comes from not regulating or micromanaging the individual macros that make up what your insulin's doing, what the hormonal side is doing. So we have the qualitative and the quantitative. The quantitative side is simply this many calories, this many macros, or this of the macros, this of the protein, fat. But then you also have the qualitative side, which is more influenced by the macros. And if you get precise with the qualities of the foods you're eating, you will experience a different sensation during your fat loss. We know fat loss will occur, but we don't know how it will feel when it occurs unless we manage the qualitative side. And this is often why people will relapse, right? I'm using that term relapse for fat loss, but essentially this is why people will gain back weight and crash after their diet. Maybe you've even had that, because the thing is, when you're just counting one variable, the quantitative variable, the veto card of calories, which is the primary driver of fat loss, then you're not micromanaging these other aspects, and you may hit your calorie goal, and after a certain point, hormones are going to regulate in a certain way that throw off the balance of hormones you had when you started out, and it was easier. So lowering insulin levels inherently makes fat loss easier. Why is that? Your appetite is directly correlated with your insulin levels and your insulin stability, and insulin stability moment to moment is going to be highly dictated by your insulin sensitivity. So insulin sensitivity means how effectively your body is going to use an insulin surge. So, for example, people who are type 2 diabetics, they've either experienced insulin resistance, so they're no longer as sensitive to insulin, or their body has shut off insulin from being used entirely. They don't produce any more insulin. So type 2 diabetics, they've basically reduced their efficiency at using insulin because insulin is going to be responsible for storing fat. The body is trying to shut off fat burning. That is what type 2 diabetes is. It's essentially your body is trying, for most people, it's trying to shut off that ability for the body to store fat because it already has enough. And it's a new disease. This disease was not around for any time before, up until the emergence of the standard Western diet, which is very high in processed carbohydrates. Processed carbohydrates, and I know my room's a mess, but my dog's there sleeping. Processed carbohydrates and processed fats. So when we're talking about the qualitative quantitative, I had always expressed this, and I'm going to express it in a slightly different way now. This is the supply and demand theory of insulin, and I'm very excited for this because this is something I'll probably write about eventually. And although I'm not an economics guy, maybe some economics majors can help me out in the description or in the comments and tweak up some of the slight mechanisms of this. But essentially, think of it this way. Calories are like the supply because they supply insulin, which is this primary currency of whether your metabolism, right, whether metabolically you're going to go up or down. Insulin will determine whether you go up or down, and the supply of that currency is calories, okay? How much each food supplies is a different question, but I'm going to keep things broad. Calories are the supply, and insulin sensitivity, well, insulin itself is the demand. So the insulin sensitivity one has is their demand. So when you are working out, you're inherently creating more demand because this is an insulin sensitivity producing activity because it breaks down tissue. It creates demand. Even people who are type 2 diabetics who are fully insulin resistant can experience reversing effects because high intensity exercise breaks down tissue and all of a sudden creates this demand. There is plenty of supply. And if you're an economics guy, you'll know that when there's a load of supply, right, too much insulin, the demand goes down. When the demand goes down, there's like if it crashes to the point where there's no more demand, it could be because everybody has it, right? There's no demand for, nobody's selling oxygen, right? We all have it. In this case, the demand is there, funny enough, but we just don't have a price on it. But essentially, when the supply gets through the roof that everybody has it, nobody's paying for it. So the monetary demand, the metabolically expensive, that's the currency, is no longer experiencing any demand because the supply was so high. You had it all the time. There was insulin floating around the bloodstream at all times. This is what type 2 diabetic, right, symptoms, insulin resistance are. They are an overload of supply of insulin, this currency, right? And calories are the supply of this currency, right? So when everybody has a certain value, the demand goes down. There's a certain commodity, service, whatever it could be, the demand drops. And this is what insulin sensitivity dictates. So when we're talking about somebody who is in a insulin sensitive state, somebody who is an athlete, somebody who is, their body is always breaking down tissue. They are highly insulin sensitive because their body really wants to be efficient with repairing, because our bodies are survival machines. So when we're talking about, how this applies to fat loss, in order for somebody to lose more weight than simply what their calories dictate, we have to increase the demand. That's where I'm getting at. If you want to lose, everybody frames this as, 3,000 calories is your metabolic maintenance, right? And as long as you get below that, after all the day's activities and all accounting for all that, you will lose weight. Well, yes, you will, but it's because your body has produced less insulin as a result of lower calories. But lowering calories isn't the only way to lower your insulin. Now, it is one way to lower your insulin in a controlled, precise, and measured manner, right? Because this is essentially what calorie counting can attribute a lot of its success to, is the fact that people begin to count everything they eat, and essentially they know exactly how much they're eating, no more, no less, and in one sense, exactly how much they're lowering their insulin, no more, no less. So that does help people stay on top of things, because it's hard to eyeball a diet, unless there's a diet that simply is restrictive of a certain macro, like the keto approaches. But when we're talking about managing insulin in a way that's inclusive of all foods, simply, you need precision. You need calorie counting. That's the way it works, because it's your only way of managing exactly how much insulin you're lowering. But of course, macronutrient ratios of that calorie makeup does play a role, in addition to the person's subjective insulin sensitivity and how much insulin they produce, right? Because everybody's different in that way. But we know isolating for calories and taking it down in a controlled amount will result in less insulin for you particularly. Now, this example I'm about to throw at you is going to really hammer home this concept. So let's say we have somebody who is, 3,000 calories after all the expenditure, their height, their weight, activity level, 3,000 calories will keep them the same. If they start eating less, they will produce less insulin. And of course, you can say that the demand is also increased because of the calorie reduction, right? That is one way to look at this demand dynamic, because it's the total energy demand, right? So that is one thing. But here's the thing. Our bodies have a whole savings account of energy stored as fat. Now, bear with me. I'm trying to stick with the economical analogy here. But we have an entire savings account, and even if you think there's not much filled up in your savings account, this is the world of fat loss and metabolism. We all have at least a good amount in our savings account. Even if you're like 9% body fat, you still have a good amount in your savings account. Now, there's ways to make this more complicated by talking about muscle as investment accounts or a high interest account, because you don't want to be over your limit, like pushing your muscle to the point where you're using it up, but you also invest in it as a asset, because growing muscle is something that we all want. But I'm not going to take it that far, at least for this video. But when we're talking about this whole dynamic of calorie reduction, it is one way to increase demand, because we're reducing the total energy, which is then reducing the total amount of the anabolic hormone, insulin. So if somebody eats 2,000 calories a day, then we know, okay, their maintenance was 3,000, they're going to lose weight at a, rate of essentially whatever the calorie deficit was. Excuse my dog. She was downstairs now because I had to cut this video. So the person's weight loss is entirely dictated by calories if you accept that model. But here's the thing. If you get somebody who eats 2,000 calories and they cram it into 1 hour, that means they spent 23 hours of the day in a low insulin state. So realistically, we have put more demand on their metabolism than simply the calorie reduction itself. So what this does is, if somebody had eaten in a small eating window, right, a 1 hour eating window, it's not simply that they're eating just the calories in that small amount of time and, you can fill yourself up easier, right, with less food. That is, you're still thinking along the, methodology of calorie counting. You're still thinking on the quantitative side there. You have to open your mind to the other side of the coin, because there's always two sides to a coin. You can't have just one, and look at the qualitative side. So that means if they ate 2,000 calories and you get somebody else who ate 2,000 calories, and one person didn't allow, a significant insulin drop via intermittent fasting, for example, let's say somebody fasted the entire day except for 1 hour, they have 23 hours of a lower insulin state, right? Because when all of us wake up in the morning, that's our lowest insulin state for the day. If you ride that out, essentially, your body will get to the point where there is more demand, because simply, moment to moment, as every hour increases, your body is experiencing no food coming in, so it can't have an elevated insulin level. There are other factors that can stress people out and raise insulin, for example, which I could get into, but example, hopefully this isn't too confusing. If you have a cortisol spike and you release some muscle glycogen, some glucose at that point, right, whether from glycogen, liver, whatever, then as a result of that blood sugar being released in the bloodstream, insulin will be released to reduce it. But that's a different topic entirely separate from food, because food is where a majority of the insulin spikes occur. But when we're talking about, back to the main focus of this video, which is how expensive this tissue is, and somebody who is eating in a 1 hour period, right? This person, throughout 23 hours of the day, was in a heightened fat burning speed, right? Think of it like this. If we have a car and I tell you that a car is going to travel 3,000 kilometers in a day, treating things by only the calorie measuring stick is like saying you don't care about the pace of the car. But if you have a car that's going, on the highway, right, for 23 hours of this trip, right? Yeah, they're still going to hit the same net amount of kilometers of distance, but they're going to burn up more fuel because they're hitting higher elevations of speed. So essentially, they're increasing their fat burning rate, how much the engine is going through at one particular moment, right? That particular moment being the 23 hours of the day. So on an individual level, they're in a state of higher demand. You're putting more demand on the metabolism, which, there are ways to break this analogy, because too much stress on the metabolism leads to other problems like adrenal fatigue, etc., endocrine system disruption. But the point of this video is there's a qualitative side to fat loss and a quantitative. There's not simply the quantitative, and we can further break down this qualitative side by looking at insulin as the primary currency of fat loss, because reducing calories is simply one way to reduce your insulin. And this is why people who can do, you can lose weight on any diet, but people who do the keto stuff and people who do intermittent fasting and prolonged fasting, they'll also feel less appetite because their insulin level is stabilized. It's not experiencing any of these volatile spikes. And essentially, those spikes promote your body to start to desire to build more, because it's trying to build, it's trying to get as much as it can do, right? So that was it for this video. Thank you for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe. And what I want you to do is start a discussion in this comment section, because this video is one that I want to be a thought-provoking video, a discussion insider, especially because I'm not, an economics expert. So I want other people who have a general idea of the metabolic mechanisms to tie this into the economic side of things, because I'm fairly certain that this analogy of supply and demand works very well with insulin, but there are probably other ways to break this analogy. And the simplest way to describe things is the qualitative, quantitative, but I want to further break this down and essentially tweak how this ties into economics. Just because it's something that we can all inherently agree on. That's what economics is in one way, because it's a mathematical, scientific philosophy. So that's it for this video. Go watch my other ones, especially in the Any Diet playlist and from the New Age Fitness Principles playlist, because this will give you plenty of fuel for the fire of fat loss, but not specific to any particular diet, simply taking principles from other diets and applying them across the whole sphere of fat loss diets. Thank you again. Anthony Romano. Peace.